Welcome to DebtCircle Sundown Brief for the 21st of May 2026. Let's take a complete look at today's action across India's debt markets, money markets, government securities, currencies, commodities, and primary bond issuances. Starting with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds traded today. Goswami Infratech Private Limited recorded a yield of 21.70%, with a trade value of Rs 2,835.58 lakhs. Kirtana Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 17.72%, with a trade value of Rs 0.07 lakhs. IIFL Samasta Finance Limited recorded a yield of 17.46%, with a trade value of Rs 0.01 lakhs. UGRO Capital Limited recorded a yield of 17.08%, with a trade value of Rs 1.00 lakhs. Ambium Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 17.07%, with a trade value of Rs 0.40 lakhs. Moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds traded today. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00%, with a trade value of Rs 3,534.27 lakhs. IFCI Limited recorded a yield of 9.005%, with a trade value of Rs 1,153.75 lakhs. Nuvama Wealth Finance Limited recorded a yield of 9.00%, with a trade value of Rs 30.00 lakhs. Another Nuvama Wealth Finance Limited bond recorded a yield of 9.00%, with a trade value of Rs 30.00 lakhs. A third Nuvama Wealth Finance Limited bond also recorded a yield of 9.00%, with a trade value of Rs 30.00 lakhs. Now looking at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at Rs 16,029.24 crore. Gross sales stood at Rs 18,563.11 crore. Net investment stood at negative Rs 2,533.87 crore. Net investment for May month to date stood at negative Rs 37,505.580 crore. Turning to foreign portfolio investor debt market investments. Under the general limit category, gross purchases stood at Rs 18.82 crore, while gross sales stood at Rs 92.65 crore, resulting in a net investment of negative Rs 73.83 crore. Under the VRR category, gross purchases stood at Rs 1,016.14 crore, while gross sales stood at Rs 769.28 crore, resulting in a net investment of Rs 246.86 crore. Under the FAR category, gross purchases stood at Rs 2,674.13 crore, while gross sales stood at Rs 2,784.02 crore, resulting in a net investment of negative Rs 109.89 crore. Net investment for May month to date stood at negative Rs 62.96 crore under the general limit category, Rs 324.62 crore under VRR, and Rs 4,056.57 crore under FAR. Net investment for calendar year 2026 year to date stood at negative Rs 3,358 crore under the general limit category, negative Rs 1,079 crore under VRR, and Rs 14,265 crore under FAR. Moving to money market rates. Call rates stood at 5.28%, tri-party repos stood at 5.20%, basket repos stood at 5.25%, special repos stood at 5.07%. Now to India government bond yields. 1-year government bond yield stood at 6.18%, 3-year government bond yield stood at 6.68%, 5-year government bond yield stood at 6.92%, 7-year government bond yield stood at 7.06%, 9-year government bond yield stood at 6.99%, 10-year government bond yield stood at 7.10%, 15-year government bond yield stood at 7.39%, 30-year government bond yield stood at 7.68%. Moving to Treasury bill yields and auction cutoffs. 91-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.52%, 182-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.75%, 364-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.98%. Turning to liquidity indicators, net liquidity injected stood at negative rupees 1,91,572 crore. Standing deposit facility stood at rupees 2,09,146 crore. Marginal standing facility stood at rupees 1,569 crore. Now looking at MIBOR OIS rates. 1-year MIBOR OIS stood at 6.32%. 2-year MIBOR OIS stood at 6.52%. 3-year MIBOR OIS stood at 6.70%. 5-year MIBOR OIS stood at 6.80%. Moving to modified MIFOR rates. 2-year modified MIFOR stood at 7.22%. 3-year modified MIFOR stood at 7.21 crore. 4-year modified MIFOR stood at 7.46%. 5-year modified MIFOR stood at 7.59%. Turning to currency markets, the US dollar to Indian rupee closed at 96.40, compared with the previous close of 96.84. The euro to Indian rupee closed at 111.90, compared with the previous close of 112.35. The British pound to Indian rupee closed at 129.46, compared with the previous close of 129.77. The Japanese yen to Indian rupee closed at 0.61, unchanged from the previous close of 0.61. The Chinese yuan to Indian rupee closed at 14.15, compared with the previous close of 14.22. Now to commodities and market indices. Gold, 24 carat 99.9 purity, closed at rupees 15,993 per 10 grams, compared with the previous level of 15,835 rupees. Silver closed at 2,850 rupees per 10 grams, compared with the previous level of 2,800 rupees. Crude oil 2,800. Crude oil closed at $106.93 per barrel, compared with the previous level of $107.94 per barrel. The Sensex closed at 75,183.36, compared with the previous close of 75,318.39. The Nifty closed at 23,654.70, compared with the previous close of 23,659.00. Finally, let's look at India's primary corporate bond issuances for the day. Unifin's Capital India Limited raised 45 crore rupees through bonds with a tenure of 25 months and a coupon of 13.00%. The issue was rated BBB- by CRISIL Ratings Limited. Leela, MAS Financial Services Limited raised 360 crore rupees through bonds with a tenure of 61 months and a coupon of 9.90%. The issue was rated AA- by CARE Ratings Limited. Bajaj Finance Limited raised 150 crore rupees through bonds with a tenure of 121 months and a coupon of 8.08%. The issue was rated AAA by CRISIL Ratings Limited and ICRA Limited. Muthoot MCred Limited raised 300 crore rupees through bonds with a tenure of 31 months and a coupon of 9.30%. The issue was rated A by ICRA Limited. Indel Money Limited raised 150 crore rupees through bonds with a tenure of 23 months and a coupon of 9.75%. The issue was rated A- by India Rating and Research Private Limited. That concludes DebtCircle Sundown Brief for the 21st of May 2026. Stay tuned for more updates on India's debt and fixed income markets.